It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the third week of Psyche. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution dedicated to research-based engagement. And we are a part of an international network of 8 galleries. Psyche is our 5th exhibition, our 3rd online exhibition. And with it, we explore the absolutely fascinating and bewildering nature of the human mind. Today, it is a huge pleasure for me to welcome Shruti Kapila, a colleague and a dear friend, with her lecture, The Two Lives of Psychoanalysis in India. Shruti Kapila is an intellectual historian and political thinker, currently university lecturer in history and convener History and Politics Tripos in the Faculty of History and fellow at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge University. Born, educated, and made in India, Kapila graduated from the Punjab University, Chandigarh with top honors before reading for a master's degree in modern history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, following which she got her doctorate from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Her professional life has been international. Prior to Cambridge, she held a research position at the University of Oxford and was earlier assistant professor at Tufts University in the United States. Her principal fields of scholarship and publication are modern and contemporary India and global political thought. She also writes on the history of modern science and race, gender, and political violence. I'm absolutely delighted because the project she will speak from today is something she has been engaged with for a very long time. And many of us then, as peers and colleagues were fascinated by her findings, and I look forward to what she's now making of it. Do not forget some of our upcoming programs. Allow me to mention a couple of them. Hamlet's Live, the first episode with a performance by Preetham Koil Pillai on 15th of April at 5 p.m., which is tomorrow, and a public lecture in the series that Shruti is tonight speaking in. We have Ted Porter speaking about representing heredity, asylum tables of family insanity, and that's at 6:30. So looking forward to welcoming you tomorrow as well. But now over to Shruti, and do remember to put in your questions in the Q&A box. Looking forward to listening to you, Shruti.
Okay, thank you so much, Janavi. I mean, I thank you partly because you forced me to out this work, which has, of course, been a part of my entire adult life, but I have been either very private about it or very, how could I put it, neglectful of it, because I've just, as you know, done a book on political thought in India, which is very informed by psychoanalytic thinking. But my PhD at SOAS, which was done with David Arnold, and that's how we first met, because as a historian, I was, my PhD was on the history of psychiatry and psychoanalysis in India. And so I have a manuscript in sort of buried in my many, in my office here, which is on the history of the psychosciences and selfhood, and I'm hoping to return to it. So your invitation is both timely, but also a bit daunting because I haven't really done this in more than a decade. So I would like your indulgence, and also just as a sidebar, I'm also in training to be a psychoanalyst part-time in London, and the persuasion is very Freudian, Lacanian. But today I'm planning on giving really a kind of bare bones sketch of the trajectory of psychoanalysis in India. So rather than some heavy duty concept thinking, which I'm happy to take questions on, my talk is, I know that you're a public space gallery. I just thought, let me just at least try and do some of the basic kind of framework making of how psychoanalysis comes to India, what it's about, and the like. And okay, so let me, start. Let me start with something everyone knows about, at least at one level. A man of, tells us a lot psychologically about India today, that he is also the figure most denigrated, or is kind of easily being denigrated for no good reason or good reason, but the focal point of many passionate debates in India today. And let me start with actually Nehru, since everyone knows something about him. to say that Nehru's, both his autobiography and the discovery of India is littered with references to Freud. And that was in a way, I didn't come to psychoanalysis through Nehru, but this is the most obvious reference point to Indians, in the sense that even in the 30s, when Nehru wrote in the late 30s his autobiography, it is quite early in the history of psychoanalysis to grapple so deeply with Freud. And what is, but also in the discovery of India, Nehru also uses, again, a large number of Freudian, this is also 46, large number of Freudian concepts, not just things like we use today, like say, for instance, subconscious, introvert, extrovert, this kind of psychological language, which is replete today in late 20th century, or certainly in the early 21st century. These words are they're not used very loosely in Nehru's two books, but they are really used as conceptual frameworks, allowing him to make certain kinds of big moves. But I wanted to start, before I go into Nehru, to say that, of course, there is today an explosion of psychological terminology. I just have to use the word trauma, and everyone will have some version of it to narrate, to think about, and the like. This was actually not the case 100 years ago. Psychoanalysis did not, in a way, permeate the kind of atmosphere as quickly as, say, today it seems to be part of the linguistic register. But India was quite early in grappling with the psychological grammar, and particularly in its aesthetic and literary genres. And I will come to a little bit of a division of what happens to this vocabulary in India in this period. And of course, today we all are, aware of the work of Frantz Fanon, and how Fanon uses, is using psychiatry, particularly psychiatry, not so much psychoanalysis, to really talk about the colonial experience, theorize the colonial experience. Now, India doesn't quite produce a Fanon, and this is a piece that is coming out in the magazine Aeon from me in a couple of months, that why India, despite having a very rich disciplinary history of psychoanalysis, but also a very generalized discussion of psychoanalysis very early on in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, it does not produce a theorist of colonization and selfhood. And why that might be, what are the kind of speculative answers to be given? And I'll share some of that today, and I'll be curious to what you might have to say about it. And of course, for Fanon, the key way in which colonial subjectivity is lost and remade, or can be remade, is through the two categories of course, violence, but also race. Now, all this doesn't quite happen in the Indian story. For Nehru, as he says very, very clearly, in his both his autobiography and discovery, I mean, because this is a short talk, I mean, a published version of it has all the references in it. He's basically seeking two things. One, he is trying to seek the so-called soul and subconscious of India, which is only leading to him, particularly in his autobiography, to a deep sense of alienation. So the autobiography is looking for what might be really the search of an authentic self, but also the search in the discovery, so the true essence of India. What is its soul? These are words he uses, but he also uses the word, what is the true subconscious of India? But all these, his point is that psychoanalysis is akin to the discovery of the self, to the understanding of the self. These are explicitly stated in his work, but also that how psychoanalysis is a kind of turn to the interior, and which is this turn to the interiority to Nehru is required partly because the condition of India, but also both books are written in prison. There is a deep engagement with the idea of a kind of a sense of loss. That loss is about freedom, but it is also a deep appreciation of his alienation from India, about which he is incredibly open about. So when today people mock him for not being Indian enough, the irony is that Nehru's starting point in his autobiography is his externality to India, or his not so much externality, but his deep alienation from what he thinks is India. And it's a kind of the bridge. He's not seeking to reconcile this alienation. He's not seeking to, in a way, even compensate for it. This is the vocabulary he uses, but really he wants to see loss as something that can be animated and can be made productive of something which is future oriented. And towards that, he's incredibly indebted to Freud, precisely because Freud is interested in the question of archaeology of the past, or both archaeology and history, but the archaeology of the self, but as a way of actually producing a different kind of future, which does not require the repetition of the past. And this is where I think, again, trauma comes in, whether there is repetition or not, of something which is deeply painful and the like. But I can take that later. But really, what this is, so Nehru, in a way, the second thing that it does for Nehru, what psychoanalysis does, is to discover and to reject that India was a child. In Discovery of India, the problem is the opposite, that actually India in its own origins, at its very original moment, is already a fully formed, quite a mature entity. And this is a part of a problem for the psychological remaking of India for Nehru. So he's very excited to go to the Harappa sites, the Indus Valley civilization sites, which are just opened up at this point. And he's expecting something quote unquote primitive or simple. And he's both astounded and deeply dejected to find fully formed cities in the Harappa sites. So he's saying, well, India's it's not simply antique, it's not simply old, but his point is that it's always fully formed. Given that it's always fully formed, how do you kind of inject novelty into its story? And this in a way then becomes his turn to also Freud, towards futurity and the like. So but what really animates Nehru and the closest relationship that Nehru forges with Freud is really on the question of religion. And he's not alone in it, because this is also the key debate going on in Indian psychoanalytic society, to which I will come to in a minute. For first, I mean, since I am speaking to a kind of science gallery people, one of the ways in which Nehru is on the side of Freud, and Nehru has read a fair number of Freud, but most importantly, he has read Civilization and its Discontents. And if those who don't know it, it's an interesting book by Freud, precisely because it's written on the eve of Nazism in Europe. So it's written in the late 20s, 30s, to really, this is a part of Freud's later oeuvre, which is moving away from psychopathology of the individual or of the everyday, to really discuss meta-psychological problems and meta-historical problems, primarily around the formation of norms, whether they are around leadership, what we could call dictators today, or mass psychology. To put it very bluntly, he's interested in mass psychology, but at the same time, he's interested in the formation of new ideological tropes and the persistence of religion in human life. And mostly he's interested in the question that he would be asked also by the League of Nations to address in this period. Einstein would engage Freud in a debate around why wars take place. So in the 30s, Freud is completely immersed in this problem. At the same time, you have Nehru, who is in prison both in the 30s and 40s for long spells. Nehru is compelled by two major problems. Of course, the constant inter-religious warfare or civil war in India, because the so-called communal question has become incredibly violent. And Nehru is grappling certainly in his autobiography on this question about religion and science, not simply at some abstract level of policy making, but as human experience and what it might do to human life and what it might do to the interior, to the psyche. And his first answer is a personal one. It's a confessional one. I feel the autobiography is very heavily self-edited because a large number of extracts, particularly around dreams and the like, are left midway in very frustratingly in the autobiography. So it has a confessional tone, and he's arguing that in his autobiography that, well, all the people who are religiously minded, all his friends like Maulana Azad and even Gandhi, which will become more and more clear, they find solace in religion. They have a kind of way in which religion allows them a kind of, not just an interiority, but a subjectivity. And Nehru this is the beginning of his alienation. He has alienation on number of themes, but his alienation is primarily on this, and it starts very early on in his life when he is inducted by his family into theosophy, and Annie Besant is there in the Nehru household to kind of make him a theosophist. And he writes with sort of the degree of self-disgust at that moment in his life. And so in a way, religion always, he reads a lot, but it leaves him cold. There's no other way to put it. So he's arguing that for science to him then becomes the kind of things that we associate Nehru with, that it is a form of assurance in public life, that it's not meant to be a kind of alienating experience, but science is a kind of deeply, if I can use the word, sentimental experience, a kind of way in which passions are not simply cooled, but they are kind of redirected in a way which would be productive. It is also seen very openly as a kind of palliative to violence that communal violence has. And for him, religion would be on the side of repression as a force which represses the true true potential of humanity. And in that sense, he's slightly dissimilar to Freud, because Freud would agree with a large number of things. But unlike Nehru, Freud would be very clear that you can't just undo religion. As he would say that he was a godless man, which meant that he was, Freud himself was an atheist, but he could never get out of his civilizational inheritance of being a Jewish man. And in that sense, I think Nehru is, I wouldn't say on the reductive side of this debate, as much as, unlike, he's more on the side of trying to create a kind of bridge. There's no other way to put it, just a kind of simple bridge between science, between violence and religion through science. So science becomes that bridge that can actually stop this problem for him. And the big debate, of course, comes. This is where he will actually part ways, and very explicitly, the autobiography becomes very explicit in its debate with Gandhi after the Bihar earthquake in, I think, 1934, when Gandhi says, well, this is when hundreds of people die in Bihar, and this is after the temple entry movement. And he chides Indians and says, well, this is kind of, the reason that, because we haven't really done caste reform, this is a kind of answer, it's the Providence's answer. And Nehru takes a very strident tone in the autobiography at this point, to kind of forge a different entity for himself from Gandhi. So he would actually, from then on in the autobiography, but also more clearly in the discovery, will argue that he represents the conscious outer spirit of India. and that Gandhi really represents the inner subconscious, perhaps even undisciplined core of India. And so in a way, Freud and this debate around psychoanalysis actually allows Nehru to find actually his own identity, if I can use that word, vis-a-vis Gandhi, who is actually quite an overwhelming figure for Nehru throughout the autobiography. So he's the true father, not quite apart from Motilal. And in a way, much like in the Freudian demand that you must overwhelm the father to become your own person, there's a kind of very massive move in the autobiography around the mid-30s moment where he's entirely respectful of Gandhi, but he has kind of also reduced him as a figure whom he has overcome through this debate via Freud on questions of civilization, violence, and the like. So but in that sense, Nehru was very much part of what had happened to the Indian psychological movement. And let me just give a thumbnail sketch of it. So he was very much in keeping with what had happened in previous debates around psychoanalysis and its birth. First and foremost, and I think the missing over top, the first thing Helling is missing, but in 1865, you really have the first move towards what we can call psychology, and very formally speaking, and the figure is Mahenderal Sarkar. Some of the historians of science here would know who he is. And he is interesting because at the height of positivism, remember in Bengal, Comte and the like are everyone's favored thing. Again, those debates are very much around religion and science, and debates around mid-19th century debates on rationalism. And Mahenderal Sarkar would make a series of very powerful interventions in very well-attended lectures, which would be about psychology and an anti-positivist thrust to thinking about the mind and the like. This is incredibly important because the other neighboring discipline, which is discussing all this, is, of course, this new systematization of Indian philosophy that is going on in this period, which is taking on a Kantian turn. And Jonathan Ganeri has written about it, but there is also this long standing idea that you could say so-called high Indic philosophy, whether it's Hindu, Buddhist, or Tantric, the sum total of it is always about the self. It's deeply psychological to begin with and end with. So Mahenderal Sarkar makes an interesting move because he wishes to kind of carve out a completely different space from the Indic tradition. And at the same time, he is able to sort of turn his back also on prevailing and dominant debates on positivism, which actually is very, very productive because it's quite early in the 1860s, but it means that there are kind of continuous generations of scholars, but especially from, as I said, philosophy, emerging discipline of a kind of new philosophy in India. And 1890 to 1910, as everyone knows, here in the history of science in India, is supposed to be the 2 decades of when science goes Indian. That in a way, it's no longer about colonial officials. There's a whole new intelligentsia around Indian scientific men, whether it's in physics or what have you. But it's in 1905 that really a philosophy department in Calcutta would offer the first course in mental and moral psychology. And a slew of books are produced, journal articles are produced, but in true institutionalization fashion, money is raised to send Indian men, particularly Bengali men, but they would also be from Punjab and Allahabad soon after, to go and study psychology primarily at Harvard, but also in Vienna and so you have, as it were, a kind of deliberate move towards it, and there might be reasons why that might be. I'll come to that in a second. First, the trajectory. And then you have, of course, Girendra Shekhar Bose in 1917, who offers the first course in abnormal psychology at Calcutta University itself. Now, Girendra Shekhar Bose has been written about by Christian Hartnack, but Hartnack has done a brilliant book on psychoanalysis and its emergence, and particularly in relation to the kind of, as it were, British and German men in India, but also their uptakes in India. So I don't want to repeat that because I set that as a text for you all to read. But and of course, Nandi has done the work on understanding Girendra Shekhar Bose. But interestingly, what is at stake in Girendra Shekhar Bose? Number one, he's an autodidact. He's not trained by Freud or any of the kind of founding figures of psychoanalysis, but he does publish a PhD on it and writes a PhD in 1922 on the concept of repression itself, and he sends it to Freud. He sends it to Freud, and he says to Freud, well, actually, you are wrong. You're wrong on, on Freud had a kind of whole theory, what is called the theory of sexuality at that point, which Freud would actually, Bose was not aware, which Freud had actually already jettisoned in favor of the Oedipus complex. But so Bose's point was that actually what animates human life is a series of opposite wishes. And therefore, concept of the repression comes from a play of oppositions, and the key opposition, very interestingly to him, Bose, was the question of homosexuality, and as it were, the whole debate around men and women, which he's quite, he explains that as a key one. So rather than looking at it, religion and science, which he will discuss in a separate debate, the two kind of oppositions become very important, very much like today, the gender debate on what is male, what might be female, and whether these are even binary things. Well, at this point, they're saying, well, they might be a binary, but there is no stability to it in any way. And it's actually quite an interesting, quite a radical book. But of course, Freud rejects the thesis and has not, they had a correspondence for 11 years, but Freud is quite dismissive of Girendra Shekhar Bose. But at the same time, they had already set up the Indian Psychoanalytical Society in Calcutta, and it had a large number of people from other psychologists from India. And it was also recognized. It was one of the first international bodies to be recognized outside of Vienna. And meanwhile, also in the university world, an Indian Association of Psychology was founded in 1926. Now, I studied in Chandigarh, and psychology was one of the mainstay disciplines. And that story is actually 100 years old, because Indian science grappled with psychology in a way which was kind of unprecedented for many other disciplines. So Lahore, Allahabad, most of the new Indian universities would send people to study, to train up in psychology and offer courses. This was because Indian psychology and psychoanalysis was deliberately posed against colonial psychiatry. And this is a kind of quick kind of distinction. I wouldn't have much time to this. So you have in the background the Lahore lunatic asylum in the background. And the way I understand this is that there was a way in which colonial psychiatry wanted to, had kind of created a confinement of Indian society. So this was a kind of controlled experiment on Indian society from post-mutiny onwards. So it was not really there to either punish people too much. So it wasn't quite like the psychiatry story in Britain or France, where a large number of people are confined so that you can discipline the entire society, or kind of make a distinction between, so-called normal and the abnormal, and therefore what Foucault would call the repressive hypothesis. But here, this is not what is going on in India. What is going on in India is that, yes, psychiatry comes in very early. It is part of pretty much all major presidency towns. It's there from the early 1900s and all the way up to, up to the present day. The Lahore asylum was supposed to be the most cutting edge one and following on from Ranchi, but Lahore was an old asylum and had kind of taken over from the stables of Ranjit Singh's barracks, and had throughout got a range of, particularly German doctors coming to it in the 40s and 50s. But really here the aim was to sort of really see Indian society like a kind of, social experiment, and rather than to cure or heal, it was really to see it as a kind of social laboratory. So yet these institutions were very much part of the monumentality of colonial architecture of power. They were not segregated and put elsewhere in the city, but they were part of the colonial architecture of the city. So they offered a kind of role in the making of colonial power. But the interesting thing about psychiatry was that, unlike what I've just told you about the great uptake of psychology amongst Indians, Indians were totally left in the cold by it. So the Indian Medical Service, which had opened its exams to the officer cadre, attracted literally nobody to the psychiatry stream, maybe one or two. And there could be reasons for it, partly for its kind of not so much the stigma question that people associate madness with in India, but I also think there was a way in which the kind of racialized stereotypes of India were most pronounced in colonial psychiatry. By contrast, what Dipesh Chakrabarty has called Adda, a new kind of sociality allows for the production of psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis doesn't come into India through an institution, unlike, say, psychology. It actually comes from the living rooms and the chatter of men in semi-public, semi-private spaces. And this allows for a kind of discussion, debate context. And it allows for a new kind of hermeneutics or a new kind of public debate around what it is to be modern, to come to India in this point. And that really is the work of psychoanalysis in India. The two lives of psychoanalysis, meaning that really it's part of a public debate. It is not part of a therapeutic culture. And why that might have taken that route is perhaps my speculation. The first answer is the kind of division and distinction it needs to make, both as a discipline, but also as a social and intellectual practice, from its colonial moorings and a discipline associated with colonization, namely psychiatry. I'm being a bit crass here, but that is a starting point. Secondly, what Nandi says, and I stress that and develop it much more forcefully, that actually why people in India are attracted to psychoanalysis is that it is about the critical relationship to what it is. It offers a critical relationship to modernity. It allows, much like Nehru, to ask these very fundamental questions of being while grappling with very big things, whether it is religion, whether it is politics, whether it is freedom. So psychoanalysis really, like in a strange way it did to me, allows for a new language, a new kind of language through which these really seemingly obdurate and irreconcilable questions may be addressed. Whether they're successful or not is a separate matter. There's not about resolution as much as it allows for discussion, debate, language, and the like. No more, and in a way here it goes back. This question of religion goes back, and the psychiatry debate goes back also to the debate within psychoanalysis itself. So in 1937, Carl Jung, who had fallen off very badly with Freud, his former teacher, on the question of religion and the work of, as it were, the psyche, visits India. I mean, it's interesting because he's known to be close to the Nazis at this period, and he's also the guest of the British government, and he is really felicitated in India like a little god. He's taken to every major tourist site, but also has a heavy duty lecture circuit, in India. He goes to India and he goes to China and he writes about it, and it would be very formative for Jungian psychoanalysis. India and China would become very important in the way Jungian psychoanalysis will develop, which would be primarily about archetypes, both symbolic archetypes from cultures around the world, but also dreams. And I can very crassly put the distinction: if you're a Jungian, I'm being very, very reductive here, but if you're a Jungian, certain symbols in dreams can be meant to, like if you go on the web, they will tell you water stands for this, or a mountain stands for that, or and so on and so forth. Now that's very crass, but the way in which Jung approached this was very much like a universal global history of mental states, and then discovering it in a comparative framework, which could then be used in clinical practice to understand what these symbols meant. And for that reason, he also traveled across the East in particular. Freud famously never traveled. He barely left Vienna and went to America just the once. And that was also almost sort of a duty to kind of publicize the discipline. And he certainly never traveled outside of Europe and the like. And this lack of mobility is very instructive, because for Freud, and like Lacan later, dreams do not have any universal tropes or symbols that we can, there's no kind of universal grammar to it. The only grammar that belongs to it is to the psyche, in the individual psyche, and that can only be kind of made sense of in the psychoanalytic chamber, in the way in which a narration is made, much the way Nehru was trying to make a narration out of India, make a narration out of himself. So it doesn't offer grand tropes or grand meaning, but that it can only come in a kind of structured conversation. The meaning, these hidden meanings can be construed. So this divides the two men, and it also divides them because it's about what the word civilization may mean, and a term that of course Nehru would also use, and really how what the work of therapeutics, but also the psyche might be in the modern world. But this is an interesting distinction, because the Indian psychoanalysts are numerous in this period. When they're autodidacts, they're not numerous, but they do have two quite robust associations. They have an Indian Journal of Psychology. They have, they are not, they're not kind of men sitting in 2 or 3 living rooms. There is a life to psychoanalysis in India at this point. And it's really interesting. No one wants to meet Jung. And they do not, in a way, even, they don't even mention him as a visit that happened in their journals or in the proceedings. So in a way, psychology in India would kind of psychoanalysis in India would, despite Bose's differences with Freud, would remain very Freudian in that sense. And the debates really are, fourfold. And I'm going to try and come to an end quite quickly. There are 4 kinds of major debates that animate Indians at this point, particularly the psychoanalytic-minded people. One, as construed by the debate with Nehru, is the debate around really the place of religion. And this is not simply about violence, it's also about its symbolic potency for Indian self-making, and also about what religion offers in terms of emancipation and freedom, and what science might offer in terms of freedom. So it's actually, the debate is not about rationality as we tend to understand it, or superstition as we might understand it, or a division between moderns and traditions, but really it is a debate around freedom and alienation. What is alienating to the human, and what might enable it, might disenable alienation. So secondly, there is a move to kind of think around, much like Hindu chemistry and the like, to kind of have a Hindu psychology. And it's really interesting, that debate is kind of still born in this, at least in this particular segment of thinking in India. But the key debate really is around the Oedipus complex, and the one that I think is interesting on the relative place of the figure of the mother and the father across cultures, or rather in India, so that's the debate that takes Girendra Shekhar Bose towards the Gita. He will write about the Gita, which I've written about, not just the Gita, but Bose's Gita, and how he would try and think about questions of the self, but really about the possibilities of the self, through a distinction also between the role of the mother in India and the like. What interests me most about this debate, and is not the kind of usual debate about the domination of the mother as Sudhir Kakar would have it. I'm actually quite, my work is semi-critical of Kakar's because it's more Jungian more than anything else, and not least because I disagree with his fundamental claim that India lacks a psychological modernity. It's not whether India has psychological modernity or not, but really what psychology is allowing is a debate about modernity. So I don't think we can say whether India is modern or not any more than we can say Europe is modern or not in debates around it. But the debate that has interested me most, and which I have taken from psychoanalysis around the story around mother, father, and Oedipus complex, is debates around fratricide and parricide, and Freud's work on the essential nature of a mythic parricide, or the killing of the father, and for the emergence of fraternity and the like. And there's a brilliant new book out called Colonial Trauma by Karima Lazali. It is actually about Algeria and Lebanon and more late 20th century. And I had no idea, I'd just come across this book now, but it's also making a similar debate question around civil wars in the Middle East through this. And I can pick this up in question answer session. So mother, father, Oedipus complex is really about the emergence of the self in relation to mothers and fathers, and the work of parricide or patricide. And of course, in India, India's modern freedom is founded on patricide or killing of the father, which is Gandhi, which I'll come to in a second before I conclude. But I also wanted to point out this is a very kind of thumbnail sketch, to point out that actually the Hindi novel, which is what I'm writing about at the moment, is really remade in this era in the 20s, 30s, late 20s, 30s, 40s by psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis has a huge impact on the Hindi novel. It allows, if not for the dethroning of Premchand, it allows for saying, well, the world is not about social reality alone. And here the first book, which is written by a man named Janendra, who's on the top, whose book is the first so-called psychoanalytic novel, is a book called Tyag Patra, or The Resignation Letter. And it really is interested in the question of sacrifice. And it's actually about men and women rather than simply about men, in which, which is also makes this whole debate around the interiority of Indians very, very interesting. And it's also very different from Tagore and the like, because it's not simply seeking a relationship or a confluence or even a harmonious relationship between the inner and outer, but really it is talking about the impossibility of a kind of coherent self. So, it's very postmodern, if I can use that word. And the key book here, the book that really becomes emblematic of this struggle, or this is, of course, Agyay's Shekhar Ek Jeevni, which is, the man is there on the left, which is really a kind of autobiography in two parts around the relationship between revolutionary politics and self-making, and is written ironically is published ironically on the eve of Indian independence, to actually call into question the entire impossibility of freedom as being something which the self will experience were the nation to be free. And this comes out of his experience as a revolutionary terrorist, his slew so it's not an easy read. It's just been translated beautifully by Vasudha Dalmia, but I had to struggle with a very difficult version of Hindi in the book. Janendra is much more easy to read. Janendra is much more about men and women, whereas Agyay is also looking at the relationship between men and women. So both these books will talk about the impossibility, both of the conjugal couple, and let's go back to Partha Chatterjee. The conjugal couple is allowed to kind of seen to be emblematic of the coming nation. So both conjugality and nationality, the nation as self, would be called into question in these novels. But above all, I think my last point here is that India does not produce a Fanon on the right, because the question of alienation in India was, much like also Jainedra's work, was produced through a therapeutics, or if not a therapeutics, but a kind of overvaluation of the idea of sacrifice. That actually colonization could, the master category for remaking of the self in India was the category of sacrifice as opposed to violence. And that alienation, alienation was for Gandhi the key problem also of colonization, as I've argued in my discussion of Hind Swaraj, that there is a kind of destruction of experience with colonization, but also with modernity. And the way Gandhi would try and, in a way, produce a new political subjectivity, but also a new ethical subjectivity, would be through a master category of sacrifice, which would also kind of try and undo the potential of violence for self-remaking. So I would conclude by saying that India does not produce a Fanon because it produces a Gandhi. So thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. That is a lot to think about. And thank you very much. No, this was absolutely fascinating. And also, I think, given the diversity of disciplines that we bring into the discussion, I think it brings to bear upon the larger sort of public lecture series, but also the discussions therefore we have around it, the complexity that a historical reading of texts and but also of individuals allows us to have a look into. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, but I'll get started by asking you, given also that you do seem to find use or usefulness in Jung, why was there resistance to Jungian thinking in India at that point of time, or why did India go Freudian?
So I mean, I couldn't explain it properly. No, I don't have any usefulness for Jung myself. I'm in the opposite school. I'm much like the early 20th century Indian psychoanalyst Jung. I wrote on Jung, but I mean, very simply put, Orientalism. So in a way, it is a kind of Orientalist reading of India, which would say, well, there are these sort of kind of subconscious states. These are these symbols. And there's a kind of a kind of fascination with these animistic symbols in Indian religiosity. So this is not what Indians are interested in psychoanalysis. They are interested in precisely the hermeneutic potential, or its potential to explain the problems of religion, rather than seeing the religion as a kind of symbolic key to human life. So there's a kind of, and also, since we don't have time, I can just say it reductively, it's just a kind of racial typology. It's a civilizational typology. You have these European civilizations and you have these kind of Eastern civilizations, and there's magic in China, there's spirit in India, and this is what is being harnessed. So, and from there, Jung will produce a kind of series of archetypes of both personality, but also of cultures, and then also to kind of produce a dictionary almost of what you could get out of one dream, one eye. So in a way, and that's why I think those guys, even though much like Freud, many of the Indians like Bose and all hadn't really traveled to Europe, but they could understand well, this is not for them. And so they kept it really, so my point was that there's a huge intellectual division marked by an understanding of what the stakes might be in these different investments, let's put it like that, because these are, I mean, I couldn't capture the sense that actually psychoanalysis really grabs Indians in a way that is quite surprising. So it's not simply about colonization, but it really becomes a debate around what does it mean to be human, to be free. Very kind of basic questions are being asked, and it becomes part of public debate, radio programs, you name it. It's kind of part of a kind of general aesthetic and literary output of this period.
Yeah, that's actually quite fascinating, right? Because I mean, if you look at more recent work by younger scholars like say Charu Singh and others, there seems to be a cultural relationship with science, broadly understood. And you seem to be suggesting the same from your understanding of the history of people interested in psychoanalysis at that time. And I wonder at what point that distance between, say, a cultural discourse or a cultural understanding of science decimates to becoming, entirely a professional one, where it's all about, well, something else, right? Like institutions and rankings and even.
So, okay, no, so I'm actually saying that all of that is happening at the same time. So the psychology, institutionalization of psychology is being done very aggressively, starting with Calcutta, going on to Lahore, BHU, all the Indianization of universities that takes place in the 1900s, 10s, and 20s will be all about psychology, experimental psychology, abnormal psychology, you name it, and they're doing it. And at the same time, Indians are not going into psychiatry. They are not doing the medical bit in it. So I'm not making a culturalist argument. I'm not making the Singh argument. I'm making the argument that there's a Nandi-like argument, which is slightly not culturalist, which is to say that psychoanalysis has a soft landing with Indian intelligentsia in this period, precisely because it offers, I mean, he doesn't use this word, my word would be that it offers an understanding, it offers a language to be critical of the modern situation rather than just kind of residing, just retreating into a cultural study, or to say, well, I'm going to deploy my culture to manage science, right? This is what the Hindu turn is doing, which is saying, well, we'll manage this really aggressive Western science by making this relationship a bit less harmful for us or more manageable for us, because here our Vedas have it. There's a kind of way in which there's an open dialogue with it. Now, I don't make that argument in my piece on, on why India has a kind of enchantment of science. That's the word I use. It's precisely because debates on rationality in India have the greatest effect on the way they change religion. Science Indians are okay, they can take new knowledges. There's nothing too dramatic about new disciplines coming to India. I mean, because there is this kind of, some could say that's the way in which Indian knowledge has always worked. If you agree with Bailey would say it's always been cumulative. Indian knowledge practices have always been cumulative. They have never been about classification, right? But my point would be that the soft landing it has, so the rationality debates go to religion. That's why you have an Arya Samaj by the end of the 19th century, which will reduce the magic of, not reduce, will convert the magic of Hinduism to a flame, and that also, I'm trying to see these debates in relation to each other rather than as just separate. And that was what I was trying to do here, to try to put it in a genealogy of disciplines.
Yeah. No, fabulous. We have a couple of questions that I'll share with you. So Razak would like to ask you, could you bring Magnus Hirschfeld's writings about men, women, and the issue of freedom in colonial India? He has a fascinating section on Bose, Gandhi, and the Nehrus. More specifically, what function psychoanalysis and sexology plays to understand the question of freedom, both in familial and national form. I'm not entirely sure I've read it to you. Does that make sense to you?
No, actually, I have to say that I know of this stuff, but I'm not, what I'm trying to get away, and this is as I said, a very introductory talk. This is not a deep talk on any of my more interests, my more kind of theoretical interests in psychoanalysis, of which there are many. But to say that my job was not here to write a history of influences or even to approach it as a history of influence. But I wanted to ask a very basic question, which is that why did psychoanalysis animate Indians as opposed to, say, colonial psychiatry? And that was one. Number two, the question of sexology, of course, there's sex manuals all the way through and there are debates around self-help in the late 19th century from Samuel Smith. I mean, it's a big, it's probably the largest bit of the Indian printing press world, apart from producing religious texts. It's self-help books which are propelling Indian print industry in the late 19th century. So my work is not about self-help, or that's, I'm more interested in what kind of colonial subjectivity that these guys are interested in, and why is it not like Fanon's? Why is it not about breakup, violence, black skins, white masks? Why is it so kind of, I wouldn't say, why is it acquired this texture around modernism, very traditional themes around early to mid 20th century? What is science? What is religion? Where does colonization go in this story? Why is colonization so absent? And the answer is that work is actually done by Gandhi, and that he's the true psychoanalyst of India in this period, if I can use it. He's a true therapeutics of, he's producing the therapeutics of colonization. And that's partly why I was just laying out
what psychoanalysis in a sense allowed them to do, and what they chose to do with it, right?
Yes, and also that the fact is that for Nehru, it is for sure a great enabler to not just mark his distinction, to mark his distinction from Gandhi in his autobiography, which is fascinating to read, because the autobiography is very Freudian in the sense that it is structured around father figures, not just his father, but various other overwhelming figures in his life, but above all Gandhi. And it allows him to actually overcome Gandhi, if I can use that word, and without having to, as it were, destroy him. And that's, in a way, that's that's an interesting, not just psychoanalytic take on Gandhi, on Nehru's autobiography, but Nehru himself is doing that in his book. He's also using Freud very explicitly to forge a new compact for Indians with religion. So, that's the kind of very instrumental answer to what is otherwise. But, I was interested that, the Algerian story, which is the big story in psychoanalysis, it's all about trauma. So what happened? Why are these guys traumatized? Or like, why I was sorry, why not? So so that in itself is telling. But that's a discussion for another time.
No, absolutely. I mean, fascinating. Let me not say any more. And there are a couple of more questions. There's a question from Preeti Sinha, who says, considering that our religion, she probably means the religion in India, was inclined towards self, was there any influence, and again, it's an influence question, you probably might sort of answer it in a similar way, of Heinz Kohut and others who focused on self-psychology?
Yeah, I mean, the Indians are very, the kind of intellectual psychology. If you look at the Indian Journal of Psychology, they are very protean, they are very promiscuous, they're reading everything, they're making up whatever they wish to make up with it. But the dominant thrust is slightly different. And that's the thrust I was trying to pick out. And they are interested in questions of sexuality, as I said, but in the most interesting way around homosexuality right from the get-go. So it's not like, and that's why Girendra Shekhar Bose is pretty radical, because he, Freud himself had relativized the question of, as it was no longer a pathology, but Bose himself had done that in his work. And it had come through the clinic, on which I have said nothing, that actually there was a psychoanalytic clinic too. So anyhow, the answer is yes, they're reading everything, that's not the point. Yeah.
So I realize the time's catching up with us. I'll present to you the last question from Salmoli, who of course loves the talk, and then asks, wants to suggest Freud's enjoying father versus self-abnegating Gandhi as the national father who is killed. Does this difference have any potential for the life of psychoanalysis?
That's very interesting. That is Freud more productive, gentle father, as opposed to Gandhi, the overwhelming father. But no, if according to Freud, there is no such thing as a gentle father. Fathers are overwhelming. If they are not overwhelming, they're not fathers, real or otherwise. So it's not that. The question is that Freud is not a father figure for Nehru. Freud is used very, very instrumentally. It's like, you see this in social sciences a lot. People use a theoretical model and apply it to Indian elections. This is the kind of stuff he is doing. He thinks, well, Freud is the guy who can help him get through. And I thought it was fascinating the way he's saying, well, actually, India is not a child. And this is also a very anti-colonial argument, because, of course, for the empire, India was a child to be tutored, to be educated. And his point was, he was actually almost dejected to see Harappa as fully formed, because he's like, well, India is old, even in its, old as in like, even in its kind of first iteration, it is old, but that's why he liked science, because science is all about the new and how novelty can be injected into, so it's not simply about violence and how religion, but science offers a kind of novelty that India needs, and to regenerate itself. So the work of science would not simply be about, and that's why I could say that I have been struck by the Nehruvian. I think our people have done a disservice to his understanding of science, because for him it was about futurity, and despite being interested in history, it allowed for escaping the past. So I grew up in Chandigarh. Of course, people think, oh God, Le Corbusier and the lot. But if you think about it, this is such a bold statement in a post-partition civil war society. This is a society which has seen violence, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and there is no concession to the past in its architecture. There is no concession to the vernacular, and science in that sense is promissory of the future in that sense. It is also post-violence, but it is also something that you can occupy the future with. So I think for Nehru, science is a kind of, science is what Freud allows him to do is to keep religion without, without making it overwhelming. For Gandhi, it's the kind of, it's what allows for human emancipation. So, politics for Gandhi is all about the realization of religion, really, to be honest. Both, there he's Catholic about whose religion it is. But yeah, so anyhow, I think I've spoken a lot, and I'm sorry that this was kind of like a building site of a talk, but I wanted to give you a thumbnail sketch of different bits of it. Yeah.
No, I think this is absolutely fascinating. We've often cursorily, often in many, many books that, you have histories of science in India that stop at 47 in a sense, and there's the cursory epilogue, which kind of hints at this need for Nehru to overcome Gandhi, right? And then you have other social science texts that kind of take that as a starting point, except this mess is never quite solved, right?
Yeah.
And I think also, there are two kinds of scholarship, right? Like the social sciences kind of beginning from here, and the historians almost stopping here, stopping at 47. And so I think it's incredibly important that this period is unknotted precisely for these kinds of arguments.
No, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, because on the Gandhi-Nehru thing, Nehru has certainly in the autobiography reconciled with his alienation. So he's actually saying, I am not the subconscious of India. Let Gandhi be the subconscious of India, but but I'm going to have my distinction from him. And really, so in that sense, it's not a post-47 debate. Actually, it's a debate that goes to the 30s, and that's exactly right. Yeah.
And I think, I do think you started that kind of work in the Enchantment of Science piece.
Yes, thank you.
But the nature of that piece, it's a very short one.
Yes.
We can't wait to look for.
I don't know when I'm going to do it. I have no promises. I'm quite into political thought. But I'm happy to. But I will invite you. But I'm doing a conference in October on psychoanalysis in Cambridge, so I'll be in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Shruti, for taking the time to be with us this evening and for a fascinating peep into what's to come. Look forward to continuing the conversation. And for those of us in the audience, the recording of the lecture will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you would like your friends to listen to this, do share it with them. I'd like to draw your attention to the film Eyes of Stone, for which the conversation between the filmmaker Nilita Vachani and the psychologist Purnima Bhola is lined up. Also, given, Shruti has mentioned novels, a different kind of novel from the last 2 decades, Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha.
I've got it here. Please read the English translation. This is a brilliant book.
It's absolutely brilliant. I just finished reading it. So Jerry is going to be speaking. Jerry Pinto, who's translated the novel, is going to be speaking in a talk entitled Reading the Mind. Do give us your feedback and do come back to the programs lined up for the weekend. Thank you again, Shruti. It was fabulous.
Thank you, Jahnavi, for dragging me out into this thing. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take good care. Bye-bye.